Welcome to New York Comic Con. This panel is called Getting Your Idea into the Game. And when Richard Garriott agreed to do this panel with me, I just said, it's Richard's panel. I don't have to get any other game developer up here at all. He's probably got the most experience of most people I know. So for those of you who don't know, Richard was involved in the Ultima series for years. Ultima 1, 2, 3, 4, up to
5, 6, 7, 8,
7, 8, 9. We all played them. I owe Richard a debt in a way because Ultima Online sucked away a very large portion of my 20s. I used to call out sick from work to play Ultima Online. I openly confess that. And it was Bloomberg News too, so in this city, I'm in trouble. But Rich has actually had some amazing experiences in game development, going from literally the grassroots game design back in the early 80s, designing for computers and hanging his games on Radio Shack walls, to building AAA mega titles with millions and millions of dollar budgets, to now coming in and starting his own Kickstarter project for Shroud of the Avatar. And he's also the only guy I know who's actually been into space. He's literally an astronaut. I know, I have to say, because I just learned the other day that only like 500 people out of the 7 billion people have ever been in outer space. So he's one of them. 483. There you go. So with that, let me turn the panel over to Richard, and he's going to tell you about not only working in the early days of game design, building massive AAA titles, but also going back to Kickstarter to really launch a personal project of his and communicate with the fans. So Rich, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. I'm just kind of curious too, how many of you are in any way related to the creation of games, in particular computer games? Any of you in the business, so to speak? Yeah, so maybe 20% of you or so. When I was listening to the previous panel, I actually added a slide near the end specifically for game developers here in New York City. Just because as I've started splitting my time, what I consider my hometown, Austin, Texas, and my wife and now baby live here in New York, so I've been kind of trying to integrate a little bit more into the New York gaming scene. So I have some thoughts to share at the end, specifically for those of you who just raised your hands, and based on the previous panel about licensing. But I've been sort of in the pursuit of the ultimate role-playing game, since the very early days. Obviously, I think that is an unachievable standard as the industry and capabilities, will continue to evolve at least through all of our lifetimes. But I've had some interesting. It's been an interesting journey, you might say, towards now the creation of Shroud of the Avatar, which I'll talk more about at the end. That's the game I'm working on now. But along the way, I've really been doing this for almost 40 years. I actually started writing games in 1974, when I was 13, 14 years old. I've built and sold 2 companies during that period, and I'm building now my 3rd company. And so I actually think it would be hard to find somebody who's done this longer than me, sadly. And in fact, when I published my first game at the age of 19, there were basically no other people in the industry. And when I turned 20, some new 19-year-olds got in the industry. And so I've sort of been the oldest guy in the industry for as long as it's been around also, which tragically now has actually been a while. So at the age of 52, I actually have at least now a few years under my belt. But my first games were actually written on that. A teletype, where I had to first type my programs in on strips of paper tape, then read them in with an acoustic modem to an offsite computer, and then when I would run the program, it would print it out on spools of actual printed paper, so 1 frame of graphics every, 30 seconds or so. Pretty slow frame rate. And but if you look at the way that they looked, it was asterisk for walls, $signs for treasure, U was an up ladder, D was a down letter, A, capital A was a giant ant, But that's sort of a way, if you look at the middle era of Ultimas, that's still sort of what they looked like, starting at the very beginning. But I called these D&D 1, D&D 2, D&D 3, because they were mimicking my favorite game at the time, which was just after the launch of Dungeons and Dragons, as you might guess. And then when the Apple II computer came out, suddenly I had the opportunity for graphics. And what was interesting about this is at this moment there were no tools, frankly, to do anything. But amongst those things that didn't exist, there were no art tools to draw art. There were no render pipelines to do rendering. And so I actually had my mother, who was an artist, kind of show me how to draw in perspective. I had my father help me with the trigonometry in order to figure out how to calculate perspective. I then hand drew on graph paper the monsters I might want to see show up in these dungeon corridors. And I wrote in BASIC, long, strings of algebra in order to find the vertices to draw lines between. And so this game was, for its day, it's probably the first ever three-dimensional graphics in a game. It had a much faster frame rate, maybe 1 frame every 3 or 4 seconds. Still nothing speedy. But that was a Calabeth, the immediate prequel to Ultima. And Ultima also brought in some new stuff. I mean, again, there were no art tools at this time. And what I found was really interesting about the difficulties here, was even to draw that random green dot pattern for grass was incredibly non-trivial. I mean, if you look up here, this is the actual sheet of graph paper I used to figure it out. I had to hand plot pixels first on a sheet of graph paper and think in your head that even pixels are green, odd pixels are blue. Then after you drew it on what you hoped would not kind of show up too much repetitive pattern when duplicated on the screen, you'd have to convert that into binary, convert that into hex, poke that manually into memory, then write a routine to copy those 32 bytes of memory into the screen area where you wanted it to show up. And if it didn't look right, you then have to debate which of those steps did you do wrong. And or if the graph showed kind of a stripy pattern, you'd have to go, okay, well, how do I move 1 pixel, and hopefully when it gets repeated, you won't see that stripiness too much in it. And I had to do that with everything you did. Every tree, every horse or ship, as you can see, I built them all literally manually, no tools available whatsoever. But I had already started, even before I started writing, maybe before I first published a game, I had started this very interesting pattern, which was I wasn't writing them for profit. I was writing them as a self-education process, if you know what I mean. I wasn't even sharing them. I had no significant number of friends I could even share them with. It really was teaching myself to do this better and better. And that first game that I ever published, a Calabeth, was really published because the owner of the Computerland store where I worked said, "Hey, Richard, that's better than anything else we have in the store. Why don't you publish it?" And I went out and spent what I thought was a huge amount of money, $200 on Ziploc bags and Xerox cover sheets, hand copied a few on my own Apple II, started selling them on the store on a Ziploc bag on the pegboard. And one of those made it to California. The guy's a publisher of my mentor at the time. I got the company called California Pacific. They were the publisher of my mentor, Bill Budge, the guy I at least thought of as my mentor. And when they put it in a bigger Ziploc bag, they raised the price from $20 to $35. They sold about 30,000 copies of a Calabeth. They paid me $5 a piece. If you do that math, that's $150,000 when I was still a high school senior. Wow. And so obviously the return on investment of that is about infinite. That also basically tripled my father's salary as an astronaut. And so the whole family went, okay, that's a good idea, maybe you should do some more. And that's what started Ultima. But I kept that pattern of each time I finished one, I kind of threw it away and started over from scratch and made it as much better as I could. And so even though I had some competitors back at the beginning, this is Ultimas 1 through 9, as you might have guessed by now. I had early competitors like Wizardry, Bard's Tale, Might and Magic. But those games, which were also great games, and in the beginning actually often outsold me, often what those games would do for a sequel is they would just take the same game engine, change the dungeon a little bit, add some new monsters, add a new story, and sell a sequel. And those sequels tended to sell to a subset of the people that bought and enjoyed the first game. Whereas Ultimas tended to sell to all of the previous groups and more, because it really was a better game, not just a retooling of the old game. And so that really started as an accident, but I actually think it's one of the key reasons Ultima became such a long-term success. And so for 9 games, anyway, I kept growing and growing the Ultima series. But then along comes the internet. And when the internet started to, when it started to become obvious that the internet was going to be a big deal, we had already been talking for a decade or more about making a game we called Ultima, Multiplayer Ultima. And that was its actual logo when we were first putting it together. And Ultima, we kept trying to get our parent company, by this time was Electronic Arts, to allow us to go make this. But since there had never been a previously existing massively multiplayer online role-playing game, the sales projections were zero or close to zero because there was no basis to forecast it on. And so we had a really hard time getting Electronic Arts to just give us permission to make this game. But when we made the game, it became the fastest selling PC game in Origin and Electronic Arts history. Within 2 years, it had outsold all the previous Ultimas combined, almost by a factor of 5 or 10 if memory serves, and it still runs to this day. So it's not only the first, it's now the longest running game that exists in the marketplace today. And it has given me accreditation, although I think it might be Star or somebody else on the team that came up with the term massively multiplayer online role-playing game, which is the namesake of MMORPG. And that goes back to 1997 or so. But there's also some things I've really learned about game creation over the last 40 years that I think are fairly universal to all games, or at least all role-playing games, that at least these are the ones that I value, and I try to pass on not only to my team, but when I do talks like this, I try to share with people to convince them that if they're in the business of creating games or intellectual property, these are things to keep your eye on. One is to make your product, to make the story in your game socially relevant. I mean, all too many of us have played the classic RPG story that still most games have in it. And that story is, you're the great hero, your job is to defeat the big evil bad guy. You know this because you're told in the instruction manual or in the introduction. And what you do in the game is actually usually pillage and plunder in order to become powerful. The bad guy just waits for you on the final level of the game and actually doesn't do anything bad to anybody, generally speaking, through the whole game, unlike you. And then finally, when you're powerful enough, you go and defeat the bad guy who's kind of just doing, hey, oh, thank you, and you kill him. And after telling that same story myself for 2 or 3 times, I'm going, okay, there's got to be something better than this. There's got to be something more. And I began to really think about, what are the problems going on around you and I today in the world? And starting with Ultima 4, where I started to include virtues in games, and where I came up with the word avatar, which is now a standard for all characters in all games and even movies these days. Avatar was the concept of your character being an avatar was invented in Ultima 4. And that's also when I started saying, to write a better story, think about that Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, not in that you start weak and end strong, but you start unworthy and you end worthy. And finding a way to understand the player, understand a contemporary social issue that people would value wrestling with in their own mind, and finding a way to put that into a game, I think makes a game much more powerful and much more relevant, not only in the short term, but will give it legs to stand over a longer period of time. And I look back and I think that Ultimas 4, 5, 6, 7, which I think did that the best, I think are remembered in the industry now largely for those purposes. I mean, who cares about the graphics? Who cares about combat? They're really remembered for that content that really made them unique. Another thing that I've kind of sussed out is, to use a Stephen Colbert word, truthiness. If you and I, if any two of us sat down to discuss what is the deep truth of the universe, I mean, what is truth with a capital T? And I don't mean in chemistry and physics truth, but I mean, what's the meaning of life? To have some really deep capital T truth. We're never going to agree, right? I mean, even philosophers who have tried to write it down and organize it in some way, it's often very complicated, if you know what I mean. And I happen to be a particularly big fan of Buddhism as a high concept. But if you get down into it deep, it gets pretty complex, and it's hard to express in a simple way for people to easily wrap their head around. And I find a lot of times when people are writing fiction, not only do they come up with something that's very complex, like the real world, or they make it difficult to read or write. They use words often that aren't spelled, they're difficult to sound out, they're therefore difficult to remember and retell. And I have found that if you simplify, if you find a couple of high concepts, the ones that are really important to you to repeat, like truth and love and courage, everybody gets those. No one's going to argue with you as to whether that's truthy. And not only can you do that, but then you can kind of build simple patterns and resonance with it. I build a pantheon of 3 principal virtues, a pantheon of 3 principal characters, cities and towns and dungeons all named as similars or opposites. Things that pattern gets repeated to you over and over and over again as you play, so you can remember where you are, you remember what you're doing. And the fact that it sounds truthy means that you go like, it's actually really something I can embrace. And even though you know it's fiction, I can't tell you people come up to me and said, I want to make sure you know I'm not a freak. I know the games you're writing are fictional, but I also think the message is good, and it's something I really enjoy. And I've had people like inscribe it on their wedding bands and all kinds of ways that they embrace it, not as a truth with a capital T, but as a worthy example of a way to frame philosophical discussion, if you follow my meaning. And any of you can do that too. I think it's the right thing to do in any virtual world that you create, and it's something I now strive to do in all my games. And sort of on a related subject is cultural evidence. And what I mean by this is what Tolkien, I think, did really well in Lord of the Rings. I still think he did it far better than anyone else has done before or since, which is he understood the world in which his story took place at an extremely deep level. And so even little ruins of things that you passed by, he knew their specific story, and there were times when that story would kind of peek its nose into the reality of your story, off and on through the gameplay, or in his case, a story. And in the case of Tolkien, he eventually went back and kind of released it, filled in a lot of those gaps with books like the Silmarillion, which told a lot of those backstories that he'd worked on before writing the foreground story of Lord of the Rings. And to me, that includes the development of languages. For Ultima, I did this runic language, which is a variation on the one that Tolkien used. For Tabula Rasa, I did this symbolic language. I'm working on now a phonetic language and new versions of both runic and symbolic. And I think that cultural evidence, that sense of history, making it real, is something that I think is also very valuable. It's one of the reasons why I really enjoy standing in line at a Disney ride a lot more than I like standing in line at a Universal Studios line. Because in Universal Studios, they confess to you that it's all a movie and there's just mundane props and you can look up and see the lighting structure. Whereas if you go at Disney, they hide the lights really well and the facade is built out as if it's real. And I can't tell you how negatively or how disappointed I was when I went to the Disney Indiana Jones ride, and along some of the old ancient temples where they had this fake hieroglyphics, stamped into the side of it. They stamped it right side up, and then stamped it wrong side up, and then stamped it backwards. And I went, oh dudes, you just failed me because it's so obviously fake. You just destroyed the third wall for me, or fourth wall, whatever wall it's supposed to be. But I think adhering to that principle of never confess it's not real is really important. And another lesson I take away from Star Wars is how important it is that the visuals you put into a game are really iconic and easy to remember. Every one of us can draw a TIE fighter. Every one of us. Those are my little drawings on the paint program on thing. And we all know what a 1950s rocket looks like. We all know what a classic UFO looks like. TIE fighter, Death Star, Millennium Falcon. We all know it, and we can all draw it. And the fact that you can think it in your head, see it, and repeat it is why it is so powerful. And back with Wing Commander, that's a Drouthy out of Wing Commander 1, for those of you that are back that far. I thought it was one of Chris Roberts' best games and the best iconography. And then in his later games, he sort of became, jet fighters with pods all stuck on the edges of them, and I can't remember what any of them look like, much less what they're called, much less redraw them. And I keep advising him, and right now with this new great work that he's doing on Star Citizen, I keep throwing shots across the bow saying, go back to this, which is at least my bias. Okay, so that brings us up to Shroud of the Avatar, the game I'm working on now. The big new feature, or one of the big new features for this game is something I'm still searching for the best term for it, but the best I have so far is called Selective Multiplayer. And I'm hopeful that this becomes sort of a new way to play what people might have called a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. I think this will correct a lot of the ills of the, in my mind, malaise that we have found in a lot of the games offered in the recent decade in MMOs. And I'll try to make that case for you here today. You know, one of the great features that has been unearthed in the social and mobile era, and a lot of hardcore gamers, a lot of real gamers kind of scoff at a lot of the social games, the Farmvilles and such of the world, as those games are not what you're interested in, they're below you in many ways. And I actually wouldn't argue with that position in many ways, except they're so popular, you really have to sit down and think, okay, what has allowed them to reach that level? And in my mind, there's really two key things that have happened that have allowed them to grow to that extent. One is the respect, the understanding, respect for, and leveraging of the friends graph. In other words, it's saying the people you care about in the real world are not the millions of other strangers that you see walk past you on the streets of New York. What you really care about is the tiny percentage of those people with which you already have a relationship. But you already go to dinner, you already go to the movies with them, and if you can find a way to deepen my relationships with people I already care about, then you will you'll serve me even better. Another key understanding of that mobile social era is what I would call the asynchronous gameplay. The fact that you and your friend, if you had to be playing the same game at the same hour on the same map with one of the 20 to 100 people who you know well, odds of you by chance being in that same game, same map at the same time is actually pretty low. And so having a way to work together asynchronously, I think, is also a critical piece of learning that MMOs can learn from and take away from the social era. And so here's kind of the deep crux of this selective multiplayer. When you think of an MMO, traditionally in an MMO, one of the first decisions you have to make, well, in role-playing games, one of the first decisions you make is what name, what class, and what type of, what race and class might my character be. But you generally also have to decide what shard am I going to live on? Which server set am I going to start my character on? And that means if all of us happen to be friends, and most people have 20 to 100 friends or so it's reasonable for us to all be friends. But if we're spread out around the globe and we start playing any new MMO, every one of us is going to choose the server set that we have the shortest ping time to, and therefore everyone on the East Coast, we'll call this side of the room, will be on the East Coast servers, and everybody on that side of the room is going to be on the West Coast servers. And that means that half of our friends we will never see playing through an instance of, or a session of an MMO, a traditional MMO. So what we're doing with selective multiplayer is first we're saying everyone in the world is on one shard. So we put literally everyone together in one instance of the world, which by the way is already one technical problem. But the way we solve that problem technically, which also just happens to work really well with the respecting and leveraging the friends graph, is as you move around the world, we're constantly making mini shards out of each map area. And so if there's 10,000 people all in one area of the map, you don't need to see 10,000 strangers. You don't care about 10,000 strangers. You want to see enough strangers to make it look populated, but you also want to make sure that those 5 or 10 people who you actually know and are on your friends graph are in the same shard or little copy instance as you are. And so we're constantly, as you move around the world, resorting everyone based upon who's logged on right now and where the strongest ties in their friends graph are to push them into the same instance of the world. And so we believe that this will go a great way into both solving the problem of MMOs having to be split up based on shard or region, as well as pushing together those people who you either already know in the real world, but also we're going to, after we put the 5 or 10 people who you really know in the same map as you, we're then going to purposely sort in other people based on the story or based on things that we think will serve you. If you've already just bumped into one person 5 times, we'll let you keep bumping into that person because there's good odds that person is somebody you will eventually say hello to because you recognize them versus instead sorting in strangers. I mean, people are more of strangers, if you follow that logic. So now we get over to Kickstarter. As I look back at my career, it's interesting. Our game industry it's very hard to do a game that sells well in the industry. There's about 1,000 titles, 1,000 PC titles released every year, and maybe 10 of them make really good money. And the next 10 or 20 go to break even, and then all the rest lose lots of money. And so that's about a 1% hit ratio. And really strong big companies that have a good track record might have a 30% hit ratio. Even like my company Origin, we had Ultima that sold really well, we had Wing Commander that sold really well, we had a game called Crusader that sold fairly well, and then we had a bunch of other titles that we made one of. And that's tricky. I think that's not abnormal for a publisher. So we had about a 30% hit ratio. I think that's pretty good. Well, my career, I've had about a 70% hit ratio. There's really 2 games that I wish I had done differently, and those are Ultima 8 and Tabula Rasa. And it's interesting to talk about those games because those games, the core of those games, I really still liked a lot. They just weren't finished well. I still even go back to those games. There's ideas I pulled forward into further games. And it's another thing that's interesting about those 2 games. Both of those games were the games I wrote immediately after selling my company to another company. And in both those cases, my new owners had a very different idea about how I should develop the next game I was working on. And so instead of just making the game that I just wanted to make, I sat down, and like in the case of Ultimate with EA, they said, we do really great with these sports games. Yeah. We do them based on releasing just before Christmas, which is the best time. We're going to ramp up all this marketing, so if you miss that window of Christmas and the marketing, it's going to be much worse for you if you ship 6 months later. The marketing will be spent and it's off cycle from a holiday season. Trust us. We've been doing, we're more successful than you are, which is true. So do whatever you need to do on Ultimate, cut the heck out of it if you need to, but ship it before Christmas. And I did, and boy was that a mistake. It was really a terrible, terrible mistake. So with Shroud of the Avatar, we said, okay, we're starting a new company. We have a couple of choices. We can either go work with another big publisher starting right now. I've kind of been there, done that. We got to go raise a bunch of money, and we did some. Yeah. Or we need to go, and I put in a bunch of money myself, of course, too. We still needed some more money, so we said, how are we going to finish that off? And we looked at crowdsourcing, and frankly, crowdsourcing at first really scared me. Because it's one of these things where if you put yourself out there and it does not work, not only do you now not have the money you need to develop the game, but you've also probably shot down your chances of working with another publisher, because they'll look at that as evidence of that nobody cares. And so we're going, if we start down that path, it's like we're either going to make it through this path or it's really the end of the company. And so it was with some trepidation that we did it. We put up a Kickstarter for $1 million, which is what we thought we really needed to make a difference in the development of this game. And we did it for 30 days, and within a week we made our $1 million, which was comforting. By the end we'd made $2 million, which was even better. And since then we've actually raised already over another $500,000, and it continues to go very, very well. So in the end now, in hindsight, I'm not only greatly relieved, but very pleased with the crowdfunding mechanism. But there's an interesting side effect, which is it's sort of like you launched your game. You're now really launched. There's nothing secret about what you've done. You're now building with other people's money. And so they deservedly want to know what you're doing to invest their money to create this game for them. And so it sort of means you're running your community management and other outreach from day one. But that's also how you continue to get them to embrace the game, and that's why some people have continued to invest further and bring more of their friends in and more of their friends, and our volume of backers and the level of each backer has continued to increase in the period since. And again, because we're trying to do this in a very new way, we started building on a tool set Unity for the first time versus roll your own from scratch. I think we're finally at the age where tools are powerful enough to use in that way. And we're also letting the community contribute art into the game. We're not only buying some rocks and trees and dirt off of the Unity asset store, but a lot of our players, we've got millions and millions of Ultima fans out there, so to speak. Of those, many are in fact damn good artists. A lot of them are pretty darn good composers. A lot of them are pretty darn good pick your content. A lot of them are actually now, we're running contests where people can actually build out dungeons and other spaces that we normally give out prizes and cash and other things with. But a lot of those we'll now use as a basis and instead of starting from scratch on a dungeon, we'll start with something somebody's contributed and clean it up and go from there to fill it out. And so this is really incredibly, this combination of activities of crowdsourcing for funding, crowdsourcing for assets, and even crowdsourcing for code. For example, you'll see in a slide I'm about to put up some cloaks that wave in the wind in Shroud of the Avatar. And as soon as we released a little video of the cloaks, people were like, wow, you guys rock, how'd you get those cloaks in there so fast? And the answer is somebody submitted to us a cloak program. And so we just used, I'd love to claim credit, but it was literally given to us. So we, these nicely flowing cloaks is something the community, helped develop. And so it's shocking how, if you go back to, again, that game of Calabeth, which was the highest return on investment I've ever had, it's been kind of downhill ever since, because even though the total money has been bigger, the investment has been much bigger. The investment has grown much faster than the total revenues of our industry. And so the great thing that's happening right now is we're finally getting a broad enough base of tools to where we can, instead of spending the first 2/3 of game development really just doing tools and not much else, we were able to jump right into game development. And you'll see, I think, in my next art slides coming up with Shroud of the Avatar, how we quickly pushed to a AAA quality. And by the way, those images in the bottom right are some of the art that users contributed to the game as an example. Okay, so when we did the Kickstarter prototype, literally what we did is we said, guys, we really better do it. We better do it now. It was about the time of the South by Southwest Music Festival. It was coming up in 30 days. So we said, okay, we've got 30 days to figure out how to show people what our intention is with this game. And so these first slides are what our game looked like 30 days into it. So we had an outdoor travel map with roads and towns. You can see that dragon flying around, and all these parts and pieces were, very little code developed internally, mostly just things we could pull off the shelf and throw together. Also in 30 days, we used off-the-shelf kind of sewer pieces and threw together some dungeons to say, look, you can run around the dungeons as well. And we got a shaft of light from somewhere, apparently. I think we might have built a couple of these, like that house in the back, I think we might have built. But we built this little graveyard to kind of show, hey, you're gonna get to go in graveyards as well. And we said, look, we want to be able to travel around the world. And I mean, we if you remember, earlier Ultima's had moon gates. Well, the Shroud of the Avatar has lunar rifts as a way to get around the world. And you can't hardly tell in this, but you can actually see the town on the other side of the portal kind of showing through the gateway there. Okay, so that was 30 days in. So, and at 30 days in, that was enough for people to go, okay, I get it. You're going to go back and you're at least going to try to pick up the Ultima series again. We're happy to see that you're back in making medieval fantasy again. And I talked a little bit about this selective multiplayer, and the combination of talk and a handful of the small amount of images was enough to get people to put up a couple $1 million. Okay, then after 90 days of progress, so just a little bit longer, you can now see how much more beautiful the landscape has become. By then we'd gotten not only these outdoor maps in, but the inventory system was working. You could actually go and start harvesting resources. You could take out an axe and chop down that tree. The player inventory window began to take shape. We began to build out the interior of these buildings. We put in the first pieces of the conversation system, and in this case for conversations, one of my other critiques of most role-playing games is you walk up, you arrive in the world, you see exclamation points over everybody that's important to talk to, you click on them, you then see a menu of things to talk to, you ignore it, and you click on it all. Don't click on the stupid things that would piss them off. But basically when you finish the conversation, then there will be a quest copied into your quest log. You click on the quest in your quest log, and now there's an arrow in the world to lead you to your level 1 mining of creatures before you get to the level 2 mining of creatures, and you get through the level grind that most role-playing games have. And so I want none of that. in this game. And so one of the other things that we had said that we started showing off here at 90 Days is for conversations in the game, you just talk to the NPCs the same way you would talk to each other. And so there's literally a parsing-like system. It's not as sophisticated as Siri, or anything like that. It's still looking for simple keywords to extract. But you type conversationally to the NPCs. You can even put multiple compound sentences together. They'll respond individually to each part of the sentence that you say. And when you're given a quest, there's no bing, it's a quest. There's no copying to the quest log. There's no arrows on the map. It's up to you to remember, oh yeah, he told me to go to some other city and look for some other item. And it's up to you to decide that it was important enough to remember, if you know what I mean. So it's very old school in that way. By 90 Days, we had the first of the crafting loops. We could at least cut lumber and build chairs and sit in them. Sort of a kind of a marker for Ultimas. We had the first pieces of housing, although they're pretty far away because we hadn't built the interiors. We had built our own modular dungeons that had physics objects now in them, to where you could knock skulls around and throw objects here and there and light and unlight torches. Now we're up to 180 days. So these are the screenshots I put in just overnight, really, to be honest, for most of these. These are brand new. No one else has ever seen these. I mean, I put in a few before I jumped in the taxi to come here. And but here you can see this, our landscapes are getting much more beautiful. The far range distances are filling in very nicely. Our scenes in the woods with the waterfalls and the babbling brooks are, I think, coming together really nicely. Here the cities are looking much more mature. There's Fire Lotus's Tavern, where the tavern keeper was. There's the Knight's House and the Village House that are all player houses you can buy and decorate in detail. Speaking of buying and decorating in detail, here they are as we're releasing them. So the one on the left is the Village House. The one on the right is a Knight's House. In this case, the one on the right is a Viking-style house. Here is the interior of one of those decorated, and as a player you can literally move any and all objects, buy, sell, and decorate any surface of the wall ad hoc as you wish. Just this release, in fact I might be actually, what day is today? Thursday. This comes out tomorrow, so you're getting a scoop. But we'll be talking about basements and dungeons that you can put under your house to add more areas to that. And then when you're underground, this is what one of those underground spaces can look like that you can add to your own. One of the things you can buy is a big underground arena that you can attach to your home. Our character avatars and conversations are finally being filled out. But when we demoed it 90 Days, frankly, there was exactly one real NPC, the bartender. Now we actually have whole towns full of real NPCs that have real conversations, and the art, instead of being just stuff we bought off the asset store, is all internally generated character models. Here you can see all the avatars now coming online. Light armor, the medium armor, the heavier armor, and the custom graphics that everybody will be able to drop onto various articles of clothing. And now that whole conversation parsing is now much more filled out, where it was kind of hacked together, honestly, at 90 Days. Now it's far more mature and looks and feels more like a completed game. And this is just a test room we put together. All the crafting is now in. So now, you can get all the resource types you can gather in the world, all the resource types you can refine, so you can mine ore, you can smelt that down into ingots or wire or bars. You can then go and forge, forge some of those into weapons and armor, and/or make all the other parts and pieces that all the other crafters need. In fact, one of the unique aspects of Ultima, in my mind, is where in most role-playing games, every character is first and foremost a combatant and may have crafting as a secondary activity. My work has always included crafting and role-playing roles, non-combat roles, as a primary activity where you can in fact totally avoid and ignore combat. And that's what we worked at very hard here. I think crafting is actually much deeper than it was even in Ultima Online. We've tried to make literally every tool that you use is actually built by another craftsperson. And they all kind of have wear, and so you can go get them repaired or buy new ones or upgrade them with another crafting person. and all the resources cross-pollinate between each other. So even when you field dress an animal, you'll get you might get venom sacs that the alchemist needs. You might get skins that the tanner needs. You might get some meat that the butcher needs, and all of those crafting things now interweave. And this is just a little test room. Each of those chests in this test room is full of all the supplies you might ever want. But at least now we can kind of test all the recipes as we're putting together. And there's just a close-up one, or the butchery place where you can hack heads off pigs and do all kinds of really gross stuff as you prepare meats. Because as you all know, in our modern society of plastic-covered food, you miss out on all this fun gore. And the next thing you're going to see coming out are these sigils for magic and combat and crafting, as we've now unified all those into this truthiness that I talked about earlier on. Those truthiness boundaries are just now showing up. So I'd like to convince you that Shroud of the Avatar is worth your time for a handful of reasons. One is, already I think we've demonstrated, me and my teams have generated the first computer-based role-playing games at all. The first tile graphics. I should have put the first 3D graphics in there. The concept of the word avatar. The concept of a massively multiplayer online game. The concept of server shards. And I would like to argue that this selective multiplayer will be one that is also worthy of your attention. Here's that one slide I added here at the end for people in New York. One of the interesting things about the games industry in Austin, Texas, which is, again, where I consider my hometown, is Austin was a great high-tech arts town, which really helped it flourish early on. The early Ultimas were served very well because of the kinds of people who lived in Austin, Texas. And we grew rapidly, and Origin was a very powerful, meaningful, leading company in Austin, Texas. But bigger companies were always in California. And eventually, Electronic Arts bought Origin. And what happens now in Austin, Texas, is that Austin has no longer or never developed the best educational institutions for games. They have virtually no corporate headquarters for the money in Austin, Texas. And so therefore, as the industry grows and contracts, if you're going to lay off somebody at EA, you're not going to lay off people at headquarters, you're going to lay off people in a satellite office, as in Austin. And so everyone in Austin kind of is on the binge and purge cycle of the games industry. And so it's very hard for Austin to maintain its leadership. And when I came here to New York, I'm going, okay, what do I think of New York? New York, I think, has a completely different set of challenges. And to me, it was exemplified by the previous panel. And that channel to me is almost everybody that I've met doing game development here in New York is doing work for hire. They're doing games that are a license of something else. And so they're making money based on getting paid to do the coding, but they're not making money based on the sales of the product, relatively speaking. And they don't own their own intellectual property to leverage into further games and to grow. And I think that's a real problem here in New York. I actually think that for New York to really not just survive as having a job to write some code, but to become a truly leading area for game development, I think we've got to figure out a way here in New York to create original IP, to make sure you're building local headquarters versus working as a satellite office for somebody in California, and to make sure that people here in town are building AAA product, not just license utilizations. So anyway, that's my challenge to the New York gaming community. In any case, for Shroud of the Avatar, we only started this year, and we're going to put it in players' hands by the end of the year. So 9 months, concept to at least a first playable in the hands of players. If anything I've told you about that game or game development is exciting to you or interesting to you, please come see us at www.shroudoftheavatar.com. Thank you very much.
Did you want to play your video?
Oh, yes, we have time, but I didn't know that.
I think we do.
Well, let me show you just one other piece, just to show you the enthusiasm, so to speak, that we're getting out of the community. This was a fun, we ran a video making contest, and this is what one of our fan groups came up with.
sickening. Call 'em modern Black Ops Battlefield garbage. Sitting here, my face redder than the Guardian. Shroud seems cool. EA isn't part of it. Maybe it will come out half avatarred. Now it's kick-started. Everybody asking more questions than a gypsy in a wagon. Haven't played Ultima? You really got to. You only live once, YOLO. Not you. Rich comes, rich comes. Tell the whole world the bells have rung. Grab your club maps, embrace your brain. Shroud of the avatar's gonna be insane. Lord Rich comes, Lord Rich comes. Tell all your favorite friends to come. LB's back, I tell my soul. Just to meet every one of these stretch goals. Where you been? Did you walk through a moon gate? Be a shaman or a new place. Still in U7, that's all I wanted to play. Got to say, that's my favorite to date. All started off with a Calabeth. And since you know, we've been waiting with shallow breath. Hear ye, read all about it. LB's back and the avatar shot. There wasn't a Britannia man or chillin', just waiting for the fans to hand him millions. He's no has-been, he's back on the cloth map. He don't give a giant rat's ass. All snap. Lord British comes, Lord British comes. Tell the whole world the bells have rung. Grab your club maps, embrace your brain. Shroud of the avatar's gonna be insane. Lord British comes, Lord British comes. Tell all your favorite friends to come. LB's back, I tell my soul. Just to meet every one of these stretch goals.
That's fantastic. See, that's what. See, we've all been waiting.
Exactly.
I've been waiting since Tabula Rasa. I've been waiting. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for coming out to hear Richard speak. And I'm a huge believer in New York City getting a gaming community, since I live in New Jersey and have to travel. And we were just saying how we have to travel to California all the time for the event. So, guys, thanks so much for coming out. Have a great time. The show floor is finally open at New York Comic Con. And Rich, thanks so much for coming. Where did you?
Yeah, stick around.
Thanks again. All right, guys. Take care.